It is April 8th, 2021. Thanks for watching the Calvary briefing today. Recently, an article by Tim Challies entitled, "Read to the End of the Story," left me with a sense of optimism and emboldened my faith. And so I wanted to share some of the ideas from this article with you today. Tim Challies basically reminded us that we cannot truly understand a story until we have read to the very end. Sometimes it's the very final page of the story that tells us the important details and tells us all about the loose strands that have been communicated that are coming together at the end of the story. We will never understand the author's intention until we get to the end of the story. It's the same with God, who is the author of the greatest story ever written. Through the words of God's book and the history of God's story and the history of God's church, we see the importance of reading to the end of the final chapter. And as we get to the final chapter of God's story and God's stories, we can do nothing but proclaim, "Look what God has done." In the pages of the Bible, we see the life of Joseph. He was hated by his brothers, sold and enslaved, imprisoned, and we think that this is a bad story. And we continue to read in the life of Joseph, and we find that at the end of the story, Joseph actually saves his family and hundreds and thousands of other peoples. Look what God has done. We can look at the story of Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth. They both have lost their husbands. They go back to their hometown, basically beaten up by the circumstances of life, and all looks as if it is horribly lost. But out of this story, we find Boaz redeeming Ruth, and oh, by the way, Boaz and Ruth have a baby, and this baby is related to King David. Look what God has done. We look at the story of Esther, and it seems that all is lost, and yet at the end of the story, we find God's people celebrating a deliverance, and the bad guy is all taken care of. Look what God has done. We look at Jesus Christ himself, the very Son of God, born here on earth, and we find him captured by the Roman authorities, horribly whipped, horribly punished, brutally murdered on a cross. And yet, the resurrection of Christ brings us hope. Look what God has done. We look at the Apostle Paul himself, thrown into prison many times. But he finds that as he is thrown into prison, he writes letters to churches. And oh, by the way, these letters to churches are some of the most important documents that we have in our church today. Look what God has done. The story continues in the church of God. As you look at the book of Acts, a wonderful church is established, and yet the church is persecuted and scattered. It looks as if all is lost. But these scattered people spread the church, and the church is continuing to spread through scattered people today. Look what God has done. And as we move even beyond Scripture, and we look at the history of the church in the last 2,000 years, we find a man like Patrick, who we now refer to as Saint Patrick, kidnapped and enslaved in Ireland. We believe this is the end of the story, but it is an enslaved shepherd that he consecrates his life to the Lord. After escaping his captivity, he returns to Ireland as an evangelist and hundreds of people are saved. Look what God has done. We look at the life of Amy Carmichael, sailing from Ireland to India. And as she gets to India, she gets sick and has to go back home. It looks as if all is lost. But she comes back, and as she comes back to India with more determination than ever, she reaches out to girls that are enslaved in temple prostitution, and hundreds come to know Christ. Look what God has done. John and Betty Stam, in the very early years of their ministry as missionaries, fall into the hands of communist soldiers. Soon they are killed. Their lives ended almost before they got a chance to start. Has their light gone out? No, their story spread, and hundreds of people taking motivation from their story went out as missionaries. Look what God has done. Susanna Spurgeon, confined to a bedroom, unable to leave her home. What does she do? She sends out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books to pastors who can't afford them and encourages hundreds and hundreds of pastors. Look what God has done. In our own nation, Johnny Erickson Tata suffered a terrible accident, paralyzed. She sinks into despondency and depression. But then God rescues her, and from her wheelchair, she begins a ministry that's given light and life to so many. Look what God has done. Well, as we look at these stories and many others, we see the importance of reading to the end of the story. We need to read not just the introduction, not just the opening chapters, but we need to read to the end of the story. I leave you with this concluding paragraph from Tim Challies. And so too in our stories, what we see through the vantage point of time in others' lives, we must take by faith in our own. We are sometimes faced with circumstances that seem as if they must mark the final act. We sometimes encounter providences that make us believe the book has been closed and all has been lost. Yet, when we are pressed, we must not think that we've been crushed, but believe that God can still bring about a great redemption. When we are struck down, we must not think that we have been destroyed, but rather have confidence that we are being prepared for some great blessing. When we're persecuted, we must not determine that we've been abandoned, but know that we are being made ready for some great usefulness to God's plans and purposes. We must wait. We must withhold judgment. We must read to the end, for no story, least of all our own, makes sense until we have read all the way to the final page. It is only then, in the light of the whole, that we see the skill, the ability, and the genius of the author, God Himself. Brothers and sisters, read to the end of the story. Don't give up hope. Don't lose heart. Have a great week.